In this lesson, we will use two methods on the Hibernate API to retrieve entity instances from the database. What we're going to be doing is pulling back some entities that maybe we persisted at another time. So they are not part of our persistence context yet, but we're going to use the Hibernate API to pull them out of the database and cause them to become entities in a persistent state within our persistence context. To get started, we're going to head over to our database. We're going to run the populate.sql file, and this file will actually truncate all of our database tables, and then it will insert some records into the bank table. This will allow us to work with the same database. You'll be able to find the populate.sql file within the working files for this chapter. I'm just going to run that script, and our database has pretty much been synced. And now we're going to begin working with the different methods on the Hibernate API. Now let's run our first demonstration using the get method. You see we have began a transaction after we've opened a session. And when we opened the session, we created a persistence context. Now we're going to retrieve some saved entities from the database. So Hibernate will read the records, translate the records into objects, and then insert those objects into our persistence context with a persistent state. In order to do that, we're going to first create a variable of type bank, and we'll name it bank. And then I'm going to call Hibernate's get method on the session. This method takes two arguments. The first one is the class of the entity we would like to retrieve, so that's bank. And then the second argument is the identifier for that entity that we would like to retrieve. So I'm going to retrieve the bank entity with the ID of 1. When using the get method, we need to cast to the type of our entity. I'm also going to put a little debugging in place, and I'm just going to say method executed so we can see when our method has been called. And then I'm also going to print out the bank name. Okay, so let's run this simple example. Hibernate issues a select statement. We get our debug output that the method has been executed, and then it says the name of the bank. So let's look at another characteristic of the get method. What I'm going to do is supply an identifier that does not exist within our database. And what will happen here is that the get method will return a null reference. And then when we try to reference the name property on bank, we're going to get a null pointer exception because bank is null. So we'll just run through that demonstration. And there we see the null pointer exception being thrown. Another thing I'd like to point out about the get method is that it will reference Hibernate's cache. So what I'm going to do now is try to retrieve the bank with the ID of 1. You see I'm actually performing that operation twice. And when we see Hibernate's output, we see that only one select statement was issued. So what happened here? The first time Hibernate issues the select statement, it puts the entity into the persistence context, and then we operate our second call to get. Well, instead of going back to the database, Hibernate consults its persistence context before issuing the database command. It finds that we have a bank entity with the same identifier, and then it simply returns that entity from its persistence context. So it keeps us from issuing an unnecessary database call. Now let's take a look at our second method, the load method. It's pretty similar to the get method. We specify the type of the entity as well as the value of the identifier. Here we see the load method being called, and we retrieve a bank entity with the ID of 1. And then we'll just print out our debug statement, and then we will print out the bank name. So let's save our application and run this example. Looking at our output, you should notice something different. When we used the get method, we issued the select statement, then we printed out method executed, and then we printed out our bank name. Well, what has happened is we've actually printed out the method executed debug statement, and then we ran our select, and then we printed out our bank name. So what's going on here? Well, when we use the load method, Hibernate always attempts to return a proxy. So a proxy just kind of stands in place of the actual entity. And then once we actually need to reference something on the entity, say the name of the bank, like we do in our printout statement, then we will perform the select statement to grab the object from the database, and then we can reference that name field upon the entity. So it tries to delay the actual execution of the database operation as much as possible. One of the questions you may have is, why is this valuable? You think you would always want to pull back an entity and then work with its fields or adjust some of its state. Well, sometimes you don't really want to do that. For example, if you have one entity that has an association to another entity and you just want to establish that association, well, you can use the load method to load that entity and then set the field on that other entity, and you would actually never have to issue a select statement to the database. So you can achieve some performance gains there. Another difference with the load method is that if we query for an object that does not exist within our database, so if there is no bank entity with the ID 123, we will then throw an object not found exception when we attempt to reference a field on that object or we attempt to use that object in some way, shape, or form. So I will save our application and we'll run it. There we see we get our debug statement method executed. And then once Hibernate attempts to run that query, we get object not found exception. So that's different from the get method where we would actually receive a null reference once we executed the query. So these are two methods that you can use to retrieve persistent objects from a database using Hibernate's API.